Racist cops laughed out loud in the middle of the courtroom as if they were at a comedy show, not a place where justice was supposed to live. The black man in the defendant's chair kept his eyes forward, silent, letting their voices bounce off the walls and echo into his bones. They mocked the way he was dressed, the way he walked, even the way he breathed. One officer leaned over to the other and whispered loud enough for the room to hear, "Bet he rehearsed his lines last night like he was gonna win an Oscar." The room broke into soft snickers, even from the back row where a few off-duty officers had come just to watch. Another officer smirked and said, "Look at him, trying to look noble. Like a damn black superhero or something." And no one said a word to stop it. Not the judge. Not the bailiff. Not the prosecutor. Because in their minds, this was just another thug who got lucky enough to make it into a courtroom instead of a jail cell. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, is that they weren't laughing at a man who was on trial. They were laughing at the man who put them on trial. He didn't say anything as they ridiculed him. He didn't flinch. Didn't look down. Because while they mocked his appearance and questioned his worth, he was memorizing every face, every voice, every word that would later appear in a federal report. For weeks, he had lived among them, letting them believe he was just another quiet, unassuming black man, easy to ignore, easy to dehumanize. But all along, he was watching. Documenting. Building a case. Because he was no suspect, no witness, no petty criminal. He was the reason they were about to lose everything. This wasn't just any day in court. This day had been orchestrated, planned down to the minute. It was the final scene in a sting operation that had taken months to build, rooted in corruption, fueled by the quiet rage of a man who had been underestimated his entire life. The reason he was seated in that defendant's chair wasn't because he did something wrong, but because the only way to get them to show their true selves was to give them the stage. And they performed exactly the way he knew they would, cruel, arrogant, unfiltered. The case against him was absurd. He had been accused of interfering with police business during a routine stop, but that stop had never been routine. It was a blatant abuse of power. He'd watched them rough up a teenager for no reason other than walking in the wrong neighborhood with the wrong skin tone. He intervened calmly, respectfully, but they didn't see calm, they saw defiance. And defiance from a black man was enough to slap on cuffs. Now here he was, supposedly on trial, while the real criminals wore badges and laughed like it was all a game. But the game was about to end. He knew this world. He knew how easily the system could be manipulated by those who wore the uniform. How evidence could disappear. How stories could be twisted. How a black man's silence was often used against him, and how his anger could become a weapon used to justify the very injustice he was protesting. He knew, because he had studied it. Lived it. Investigated it. From the inside. And now, he was flipping it on its head. The courtroom was a trap. Every camera was real. Every mic was live. The people watching from behind mirrored glass were not spectators, they were agents. Colleagues. Allies. Every smirk, every racist joke, every comment dripping in venom was being recorded in crystal clarity, straight into federal hands. They were giving themselves away without even knowing it. He waited. He let them laugh. Then, when the prosecutor smirked and said, "So, tell us again, why were you interfering with officers during a lawful stop?" He stood up, slow, deliberate, and reached into his jacket. The room shifted. Hands hovered near weapons. The laughter stopped. Because suddenly, the man who had been the butt of every joke now had every pair of eyes locked on him. And when he pulled out that badge, shiny, undeniable, and marked with 3 bold letters that shook the foundation of that courtroom, no one breathed. FBI. The silence was louder than their laughter had been. The same judge who let the joke slide turned pale. The officers who had chuckled leaned back like they were trying to disappear into their seats. And that's when the real trial began, not for him, but for them. Every word they'd spoken. Every abuse they'd committed. Every life they trampled over while hiding behind authority. It was all there, in files, in photos, in audio. He didn't need to scream. Didn't need to threaten. The truth did the damage for him. But what happened next is what left everyone in that room completely shaken. Because he didn't just expose them. He made them feel what it was like to be powerless. He flipped the courtroom into a reckoning, not with rage, not with violence, but with precision. The kind of precision only someone deeply trained could deliver. One by one, the officers who mocked him were called out by name. Their abuses laid bare. Their careers shattered in real time. And the moment they realized that the man they laughed at was the man who had built the case against them, brick by brick, word by word, they broke. Some cried. Some begged. But he didn't flinch then, either. Because justice wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. And balance, finally, was being restored. He walked out of that courtroom a different man than the one who walked in. Not because he had changed, but because the truth had finally been heard. Loud, clear, undeniable. And yet, there's one thing no one saw coming. One final twist he'd been holding on to. Something even his allies didn't know. A secret that, once revealed, didn't just change the case, it changed everything. Now the question is, what did he do right after showing that badge that left the entire courtroom frozen in shock? Stick around. You're going to want to hear how this ends. Before we start today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, prejudice, or injustice. We recognize your pain, your strength, and your history, and we believe your voice matters, your life matters, and your story matters. This story you're about to hear is fiction, but the emotion behind it is very real. To every black man, woman, and child out there, this one's for you. Now sit back, take a breath, and get ready for a powerful ride. And hey, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and support storytelling that stands for something. Let's begin. Marcus Whitaker had always known how the world saw him before he ever opened his mouth. Tall, broad-shouldered, deep-skinned with sharp eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone, he carried the kind of presence that made strangers step to the side without a second thought. But it wasn't just his build or his gaze that made people uneasy. It was the fact that he refused to shrink. He stood straight when people expected him to slouch. He spoke in full, articulate sentences when they expected slang. He drove a clean, silver BMW, not flashy, but far too nice for what many people believed a man like him should own. And for some reason, that offended people more than anything else. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, on the east side where ambition often got swallowed whole by survival. His mother, Clarice, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide while raising Marcus and his younger brother Devin, who never quite escaped the pull of the streets. Marcus learned early on that the price of standing still was getting left behind. So he pushed through school, pushed into college, pushed into the FBI. He never advertised where he came from, but he never forgot it either. The voices, the struggle, the heat of being watched just for existing, he carried it all, even in the polished halls of federal law enforcement. Now, at 35, Marcus was a seasoned FBI special agent who specialized in internal investigations, cases that made other agents uncomfortable. He was the guy they called when they suspected dirty cops, but no one wanted to admit it. His job wasn't to smile and shake hands, it was to quietly dismantle the systems that allowed injustice to thrive. And for that, he earned no popularity, no plaques, no friendly barbecues. Just results. Cold, undeniable results. The case that brought him to Jackson, Mississippi was different. This one was personal in a way none of the others had been. It started with a routine complaint from a civilian, a video of an unarmed black teenager being pinned down by 4 officers while another laughed and recorded on his phone. The video was shaky, hard to watch, but it showed enough. Enough to open an inquiry. Enough to trigger Marcus's instincts. So he packed a bag, flew south, and went undercover, not as a cop, but as someone invisible. A low-level community advocate, just another do-gooder that the locals rolled their eyes at. For 5 weeks, he watched. Not from afar, but up close. He went to town halls, sat in back pews of courtrooms, rode along with cops who didn't know who he really was. He heard the jokes. The slurs hidden inside laughter. The way they spoke about the people they were supposed to protect. He witnessed arrests that didn't need to happen. He watched charges appear from thin air. He watched lives get derailed because of grudges, because of boredom, because of color. He learned the players fast. Officer Travis Harlan, mid-40s, known for his brute force and shorter fuse. Officer Rick Doyle, slick, smug, and always smiling, the kind of man who could recite the department handbook and break it in the same breath. Sergeant Paul Klein, the supervisor who kept everything under wraps, who believed the public was a threat and the badge gave permission to do whatever it took. And there was Judge Raymond Elkins, a man who had presided over the town's court for 20 years with the confidence of someone who never believed he'd be questioned. They weren't a team, they were a machine. And that machine had never been challenged. Until now. What they didn't know was that Marcus had spent his life learning how to read men like them. He knew when arrogance tipped into carelessness. He knew how racists often revealed themselves when they felt too comfortable. So he let them be comfortable. He let them believe he was beneath them. He let them laugh. And every time they did, they gave him something to use. But the operation needed something stronger than just observation. It needed confrontation. Something public. Something undeniable. That's when Marcus made a decision most agents would never make. He inserted himself into their line of fire. Not by accident. Not by chance. But by design. One rainy Thursday morning, just after 9 a.m., he saw it unfold. A teenage boy, maybe 16, handcuffed on the wet pavement of a gas station parking lot. Crying. Shaking. 2 officers standing over him like vultures circling meat. Marcus stepped in, not forcefully, but directly. He asked questions. Showed concern. The officers, surprised, puffed up instantly. They didn't want questions. They wanted obedience. One told him to back off. The other shoved him. When he calmly asked for their badge numbers, they tightened the cuffs on the boy and turned their threats toward Marcus. He let them. He let the cuffs wrap around his own wrists because the cameras, his cameras, were rolling. His team was watching. And this moment, was the spark the case needed. They booked him like they would anyone else. No ID, no phone call. Just a charge sheet filled with half-truths and fabrications. Obstruction. Resisting arrest. Disorderly conduct. The usual cocktail they used to silence dissent. They thought they'd shut him down. But what they didn't know was that this was the very moment Marcus had planned for. The trial was the trap. The courtroom, the stage. Over the next several days, the city whispered about the uppity black guy who thought he could tell the cops what to do. Reporters didn't touch the story. Local voices didn't want to stir the pot. In their eyes, it was just another case that would disappear under the weight of silence. But silence wasn't the outcome Marcus came for. The day of the hearing, the courtroom filled quickly, not with concerned citizens, but with uniforms. Off-duty cops. Friends of the officers involved. People who came to gawk, to smirk, to see the troublemaker get shut down in front of a judge who had ruled in favor of cops 98% of the time. It wasn't justice they came for. It was blood. And Marcus sat there, hands on his lap, breathing steady. The prosecutor, a man named Denton Briggs, spoke with the arrogance of someone who believed the outcome was already set. He pointed fingers. Raised his voice. Painted Marcus as a threat. And through it all, Marcus didn't blink. He watched. Not just Denton, but the officers whispering behind him, nudging each other, laughing into their fists. It would have been easy to lash out. To rise and yell. To fight fire with fire. But Marcus knew better. He had built his life around the idea that patience was more lethal than rage. That strategy always outlived chaos. So he waited. Outside the courthouse, the heat swelled in waves. Inside, the tension was thicker than the Mississippi humidity. And in that tension, Marcus sat calmly, because he knew something no one else in that room did. He wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to deliver judgment. The next few hours would change everything. Reputations. Careers. Lives. But right now, all he had to do was wait. Let them speak. Let them convict themselves with their own ignorance. Because they had already done the damage. Now all he had to do was show it. And when the moment came, when he stood and reached into his jacket, it wouldn't just be a twist, it would be a reckoning. But before any badge was revealed, before any names were exposed or careers dismantled, there was still one thing left to see: would anyone in that courtroom recognize him before it was too late? Would any of them see the truth in his eyes before the gavel fell? Or had they already sealed their fate the moment they decided a black man in a suit was something to laugh at? That answer was coming. And it would hit harder than they ever imagined. The courtroom lights hummed softly overhead as the buzz of casual conversation filled the air. Marcus sat in his assigned seat, hands still, back straight, expression unreadable. He felt every eye on him, not out of respect or curiosity, but out of something colder, more familiar. Disdain. Discomfort. Thinly veiled ridicule. He could feel it in the way the officers chuckled behind him, trading jokes not meant to be funny but meant to dehumanize. He could hear it in the courtroom staff's forced politeness, the kind that came with a smile that never touched the eyes. Every movement in the room was a performance, one designed to remind him where they thought he stood in the invisible hierarchy they had built. But Marcus wasn't there to prove them wrong with words. He was there to let the truth speak for itself. As the judge entered and the court was called to order, Marcus didn't move a muscle. His breathing slowed, controlled, measured. This was the beginning of the end, not for him, but for them. The prosecutor, Denton Briggs, rose confidently from his seat. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat with unnecessary dramatics, then walked to the center of the courtroom with the swagger of someone who believed the floor belonged to him. Briggs began to speak, painting Marcus as disruptive, arrogant, even dangerous. He called him a self-proclaimed activist with a chip on his shoulder, who had no respect for law enforcement. His voice carried, smooth and performative, as he pointed out that Marcus had interfered with officers in the line of duty, refused lawful commands, and had shown, quote, aggressive behavior in a public setting. The gallery, mostly made up of off-duty cops and their allies, nodded in approval. One even muttered, "He's just mad he got caught," and earned a round of quiet chuckles. The judge made no move to silence them. But what Briggs didn't realize was that every word out of his mouth, every exaggerated accusation, was digging his own grave. Marcus remained silent, letting the words swirl around him like smoke. They expected a reaction, some emotional flare-up, something they could point to and say, "See? That's who he really is." But Marcus had spent his life perfecting the art of stillness. And in that stillness, he held the power. Then came the witnesses. Officer Harlan took the stand first. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had gotten away with much worse and expected to keep doing so. He described Marcus as hostile, said he refused to back away from the scene, claimed he shouted and disrupted their work. When asked why force was used, Harlan said, "We were in a volatile situation. We had to maintain control." Briggs nodded along, feeding into the narrative. Marcus watched, eyes steady, mentally noting each lie, each word he would later use against them. Next was Officer Doyle, whose tone was more smug than defensive. He told the court that Marcus fit the profile of someone looking to escalate, that he seemed irritated and non-compliant. He even threw in, almost as an afterthought, that Marcus looked like he wanted trouble. That sentence, though brief, hung in the air with a weight only certain people could feel. Marcus saw the micro-expressions on a few black faces in the audience, people who knew exactly what that phrase meant. Looked like he wanted trouble. It was code. And it wasn't just about that day, it was about every day someone like Marcus had to exist under judgment without cause. The third to testify was Sergeant Klein, the orchestrator. His voice was calm, collected, his words carefully chosen to avoid direct responsibility. He spoke like a man who had rehearsed every sentence with legal counsel. He said that Marcus had shown up at the gas station unidentified, acted erratically, and posed a potential threat. Marcus noticed how he used the word potential repeatedly, a shield against accountability. It was all potential with these men. Potential danger. Potential violence. Potential threat. Never facts, just implications that gave them permission to act without consequence. Marcus's attorney, a young black woman named Nadine Cole, asked few questions during cross-examination. She knew better than to poke the bear before the trap was ready. Instead, she let the officers speak freely, let them trip over their own contradictions. Marcus admired her composure. She had seen this game before and knew how it ended when played right. Outside the courtroom, the community buzzed. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the charges were nonsense, others said Marcus had it coming. But inside, the tension was growing. Quietly. Steadily. Like a storm forming on the horizon. During a recess, Marcus stepped outside into the narrow hallway where he was met with stares that sliced like knives. Officer Harlan leaned against the wall with a smirk. He didn't say anything at first, just let the silence sit before finally muttering, "Hope that suit's worth it. Doesn't change who you are underneath." Marcus turned his head slightly, looked at him, and replied with quiet calm, "I know exactly who I am." "Do you?" Harlan scoffed, shoved off the wall, and walked away. But there was something in his eyes, an uncertainty he hadn't shown before. Back in the courtroom, the trial resumed. More details. More spin. Briggs tried to paint a picture of chaos, tried to make Marcus into a caricature of black male aggression, a threat wrapped in civility. But it was too perfect. Too controlled. And slowly, the image began to crack. Nadine finally rose. She walked slowly to the front, heels clicking with precision, and turned to the jury. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. She asked only one question that day: "Do any of you think this would have happened if he looked like me?" The courtroom went silent. She stood there, calm, eyes sweeping the room. Then she added, "And if your answer is no, why are we really here?" That moment lingered long after the court recessed again. Marcus remained seated, deep in thought. He had let them build the case, let them expose themselves. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, it wouldn't be about what they said, it would be about what they didn't say. What they never expected to be revealed. That night, Marcus sat in his small rented apartment, laptop open, files spread across the table. Photos. Audio logs. Testimonies from other victims. The work of weeks, months. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he labeled the final folder. Jackson Operation, Final Phase. He knew what tomorrow would bring. He knew it would change lives. End careers. Possibly even put some of them behind bars. But what none of them knew, what even Nadine didn't fully understand, was that there was still one card left to play. And when he played it, nothing in Jackson would ever be the same again. The court would meet one final time. And when Marcus stood, no one in that room was ready for what would happen next. The courtroom was heavier than the morning itself. No sunlight broke through the narrow windows, and the thick humidity of Jackson clung to the walls like a presence of its own. Every person in the room carried something with them, expectation, unease, anticipation, but no one more than Marcus. As he entered, the whispers began again, low, like the early rumbles of a storm not yet arrived. He walked past rows of uniformed officers who still wore their arrogance like a badge of honor, past Doyle who smiled with that same smug certainty, past Harlan whose posture oozed boredom, and past Klein who didn't even look up from his phone. The judge entered moments later, dragging the courtroom into silence. The final hearing had begun. Marcus took his place, adjusting the sleeves of his navy suit, standing tall. Nadine leaned toward him, whispering, "You ready?" He didn't nod. He didn't blink. He just said, "It's time." She sat back, eyes locked forward. Briggs began again with the same fire he'd used before. He painted Marcus as a man with a superiority complex, someone who believed he was above the law, someone who thought he could manipulate situations with smooth words and a calm demeanor. He tried to sharpen his tone, make his voice sound more cutting, but it was starting to feel forced. Like he knew this was his last swing and wasn't sure if it would land. Then he called Marcus to the stand. The courtroom shifted in their seats as Marcus rose and approached. Some leaned forward. Others scoffed under their breath. Klein crossed his arms, watching with the expression of a man convinced nothing could touch him. Marcus sat on the witness stand, placing his hands gently on his thighs, his posture calm, collected. The bailiff swore him in. Briggs stepped forward, smiling like a man convinced he still had the upper hand. "So," Briggs said, pacing, "why don't you tell the court, in your own words, what exactly happened that day?" Marcus looked straight ahead and replied, "I saw a young boy being hurt. I asked why it was happening." Briggs smirked, "That's your version. But you didn't tell them who you were, did you?" "No," Marcus replied. "You didn't identify yourself because you were hiding something, weren't you?" "I didn't identify myself because I wasn't there as an agent. I was there as a citizen." Briggs leaned closer, tone tightening, "A citizen who just happened to be conveniently in the middle of an arrest, just happened to intervene, and just happened to have an issue with our officers doing their job." Marcus didn't flinch. "Your officers weren't doing their job. They were abusing their power." The crowd stirred. Briggs raised a hand toward the gallery, like reining in noise would put him back in control. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, "that's opinion." The judge nodded, sustained. Briggs circled the courtroom, stopping near the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man wants you to believe he's just another concerned citizen. That this was all coincidence. But I ask you, what kind of citizen refuses to cooperate, resists arrest, and escalates a situation he had no business being in? He wants you to see him as the victim. I see a man who planned this from the beginning." That's when Nadine rose. "Your Honor, we would like to redirect with new evidence." The judge blinked, clearly caught off guard. "New evidence? At this stage?" Nadine nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. And once it's seen, there won't be any more need for speculation." The courtroom buzzed. Briggs's face dropped slightly, his eyes darting to Klein, who now looked up from his phone with a sudden stiffness in his shoulders. The judge sighed. "Proceed." Nadine walked toward the evidence table and lifted a small black case. She placed it in front of the judge, then turned to the jury. Her voice was calm, firm, confident. "My client is not who he appeared to be during this trial," she said, "and not because he was hiding guilt, but because he was doing his job. This court has unknowingly participated in an active federal operation. And now, that operation is complete." She turned back to Marcus, who slowly reached into the inside of his jacket. The room froze. Harlan shifted. Doyle sat up straight. Klein's foot tapped against the floor. And then Marcus pulled out a badge. Not a local badge. Not state. Federal. FBI. Gasps erupted. Even the judge sat back in disbelief. Nadine raised her hand. As confirmed by the Department of Justice, Agent Marcus Whitaker has been conducting an undercover investigation into the Jackson Police Department and this very courtroom. He has collected over 63 hours of audio, over 40 gigabytes of video footage, and more than a dozen sworn affidavits from victims of systemic abuse committed by officers Harlan, Doyle, Sergeant Klein, and others. Effective immediately, indictments are being filed. Agents are already executing arrests as we speak. Chaos didn't erupt, it suffocated the room. Doyle stood quickly, stammering, "This is bull," but stopped short when a federal marshal entered from the rear door and signaled him to sit down. Harlan looked around as if realizing for the first time he was cornered. Klein's jaw clenched, eyes fixed on Marcus. Briggs looked completely lost. Marcus finally stood. And when he spoke, his voice was low but resonant, cutting through every whisper, every heartbeat. "You wanted a trial," he said, scanning the room. "You got one. But it wasn't mine." Klein stood up. "You set us up. This is entrapment." "No," Marcus said, stepping off the witness stand. "It's exposure." He handed the judge a sealed file, then turned to face the courtroom. "You laughed when you thought I was just another name on your docket. You joked because you thought power protected you. But real power doesn't laugh at pain. Real power doesn't silence truth. And starting today, that truth is louder than your badges." Nadine stepped forward. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, we request immediate dismissal of all charges and recommend a federal oversight be established." The judge, stunned, looked out over the room and simply nodded. Dismissed. With prejudice. That was it. The room shifted again, not with noise, but with realization. Officers began texting, calling, murmuring in disbelief. Briggs sat down, head in his hands. Harlan and Doyle were escorted out quietly by marshals. Klein stood, unmoving, staring directly at Marcus. "You think this makes you a hero," he said coldly. Marcus walked past him without pausing. "No. It makes me necessary." The doors opened, and the hallway outside was already full of agents and journalists, the story leaking like a dam finally broken. But Marcus didn't stop to answer questions. He just walked, slow, steady, as the world tried to catch up to the truth he had just delivered. But even now, with everything out in the open, there was still one more layer no one knew. One final thread he hadn't pulled yet. And when he did, what came next would leave the whole country watching. Outside the courthouse, the heat hit like a wall, but Marcus barely noticed it. The flashes from cameras lit his face as journalists shouted questions he had no intention of answering, not yet. Nadine stayed close by his side, her eyes sharp, scanning the crowd for threats, for pressure, for cracks. But Marcus walked straight, shoulders square, expression unreadable. The chaos around him didn't faze him. It couldn't. Not after what had just happened. Not when so much still hung in the balance. His badge had done its job, it silenced the room and flipped the narrative. But the real weight hadn't fallen yet. The truth, the full scope of it, was still waiting. And only he knew how deep it ran. By the time he reached the black SUV waiting for him at the curb, a federal agent in a dark gray suit opened the door without a word. Marcus climbed in, followed by Nadine, the door shutting behind them like a final seal on the courtroom chapter. The vehicle rolled away, leaving behind the press, the whispers, the stunned city. Inside, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was electric. Finally, Nadine turned to him and said, "They really had no idea. Not a single one of them." Marcus looked out the window, watching the streets blur past, his jaw tight. They didn't want to know. That's the difference. They never look beneath the surface because they're afraid of what they'll find. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. "So what now? We let the feds handle the rest?" Marcus turned to her then, his eyes darker than before. "No. We're not done. What we revealed today, it's just the tip. Klein's been working with someone higher. I've seen the wire transfers, the sealed communications. There's another name. Someone in the state attorney's office. That's why the cases were always buried. That's why every complaint disappeared. Nadine blinked, the full weight of his words sinking in. You have proof? Marcus nodded once, then reached into a hidden compartment near the center console. From it, he pulled a second drive, smaller, encrypted, marked with a single label, Phase 2. He handed it to her without speaking. She turned it in her hands, recognizing the gravity instantly. You've been holding this back. Marcus's voice was low. Because I wasn't sure who I could trust. Until now. Hours later, in a secured conference room inside a federal building just outside city limits, Marcus stood before a small group of agents, all handpicked for their integrity, their record, their silence. The kind of people who didn't chase headlines, who understood that real justice moved in silence until it didn't. On the screen behind him, emails appeared one after the other, correspondences between Klein and Assistant District Attorney Jeffrey Ballantyne. Embedded in those emails were traces of evidence suppression, falsified testimony coordination, even payment records tied to private prison contracts that paid bonuses for conviction rates. The room shifted in energy as the pieces clicked into place. One agent murmured, Jesus, this isn't just misconduct. This is a business model. Marcus looked around the room, his voice cutting through the murmur. This wasn't about bad judgment. This was calculated. They didn't just bend the system, they built a new one inside it. One that fed off fear. Off race. Off silence. And it ends now. Back in Jackson, the fallout from the courtroom bombshell was spreading like wildfire. News outlets had begun to run the footage, some leaked by anonymous sources, some obtained legally. Public trust was crumbling. People who had lived for years under the weight of a broken system were finally seeing a crack in the walls. Protests sparked outside the courthouse, signs raised, voices lifted. Some shouted Marcus's name. Others simply chanted one word, accountability. Inside the precinct, panic had set in. Officers cleaned out desks. Phones rang non-stop. Some tried to deny involvement, others begged to cut deals. But Klein, he didn't run. He sat in his office, staring at the television as his face appeared on the evening news. He didn't blink. Didn't move. Until his phone rang, and he answered it with a cold voice. Yeah, he said. The voice on the other end was calm, methodical. We've been compromised. They have the files. Klein closed his eyes. I know. Whitaker played us all. There was silence, then the voice spoke again. You know what to do. The line went dead. The next morning, Marcus and Nadine arrived at a government facility where Ballantyne was being held for questioning. The man sat across from them, sweaty, nervous, his tie loosened, his hands shaking slightly. He tried to smile. Listen, I didn't know how far it went. Marcus cut him off. You approved the cases. You let false charges go through. You knew. Ballantyne raised his voice, desperate now. They threatened me. Klein said if I didn't cooperate, they'd come after my family. You don't know what that man is capable of. Nadine leaned in, her voice razor sharp. You're gonna tell us everything. Every meeting. Every document. Every name. Because if you don't, the next face you'll see is a judge, and this time, you won't be shaking his hand. Ballantyne swallowed hard and nodded. Later that day, as the press continued to swarm the streets, a new round of arrests began. Klein's name appeared first, then Ballantyne's, followed by others, names from court dockets, precinct payrolls, even a few private investors who had quietly profited off the system's corruption. Marcus didn't smile as the headlines rolled. This wasn't victory, it was surgery. The wound had been exposed, but the healing would take time. That evening, Marcus returned to the hotel where he'd been living during the operation. He stood at the window, staring down at the city he had helped crack open. Nadine entered, holding her phone, her expression unreadable. "You're trending," she said softly. "They're calling you the man who flipped Jackson." He didn't turn around. "It's not about fame." She nodded. "I know. But it matters. They're seeing it. The people who didn't believe this could happen, they're waking up." There was a long pause. Then, Marcus finally turned to her, his face softening for the first time in days. "You asked me why I came here. Why I chose this case. It wasn't random. My brother, Devon. He died in a facility that one of those investors owned. Overcrowded, underfunded, filled with kids who didn't belong there. He was arrested at 19 over a traffic stop. 2 months later, he was gone. No explanation. No justice." Nadine's eyes welled slightly. "I didn't know." Marcus nodded slowly. "Most people didn't. But I do now. And that's why I couldn't walk away." She stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You didn't just avenge your brother. You gave voice to every family that never got to fight back." Downstairs, chants still echoed. The streets were alive with something new, not just rage, but hope. Marcus stood silently for a long moment, letting it all settle. Then, quietly, he said, "It's not over. The system doesn't fall in a day." Nadine replied, "No. But it shook today." And deep down, both of them knew, the next steps would be harder, quieter, but no less important. Because the badge wasn't what gave Marcus power. It was the truth. And that truth, now that it had a voice, wouldn't be silenced again. But just as Marcus reached to turn off the hotel light, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. He stared at the screen, his instincts tightening. He answered. The voice on the other end was low, slow, and confident. "Agent Whitaker. Congratulations on your little show. But if you think this ends in Jackson, you haven't seen the real machine yet." The line went dead. And the silence that followed, was different. Because Marcus had just realized, the fight was far from over. The night after the voice on the phone had chilled the air around him, Marcus sat alone in the dim light of his hotel room, watching the cityscape beyond the glass with sharp, searching eyes. The words still echoed inside his head, not as a threat, but as a revelation. He had exposed a system, yes, torn it open in one corner, but what he'd stepped into now was something deeper, older, more entrenched. There was an engine running behind the faces of men like Klein and Ballantyne. They were not the architects, only the beneficiaries of a design much more vast than any courtroom or department. And now that the surface had cracked, the real players were waking up. By morning, federal agents confirmed that several key files had been accessed remotely overnight. A digital breach had occurred, targeted, precise, and designed to erase only the evidence that pointed upward. Not the videos, not the statements from victims, but financial records, communications between departments, data trails that connected judges to lobbyists, lawyers to private prison contracts. Someone had known exactly what to scrub, and it had been done without triggering internal alarms. It was surgical. And it meant that someone was watching from the inside. In the hallway outside a secured operations center, Nadine met Marcus with a look that said everything before she even opened her mouth. "The DOJ is splitting the case," she said quietly. "They're putting part of it under national security review. They're saying there might be international implications." Marcus didn't respond right away. He stared at the floor, piecing it together in silence. "That's how they bury it," he finally said. "They escalate it beyond reach. They drown it in layers." Nadine nodded. "And they're calling for your reassignment. Washington wants you back. Tomorrow." Marcus closed his eyes for just a second, feeling the ground shift again beneath his feet. He had stirred the system too well. And now the system was pushing back. The city was still on fire with protest and pressure, the people energized by a sudden rush of visibility, by the idea that justice could actually belong to them. But that energy was fragile. It could disappear as quickly as it had come, swallowed by bureaucracy, by time, by fear. Marcus knew that if he left now, it would send the wrong message. That the fight was over. That it had been enough. And it hadn't. There were still names unspoken, still questions unanswered, still deals being made behind closed doors. But the weight of the work, the sheer size of what lay ahead, was finally hitting him. He wasn't just confronting bad cops. He was unraveling a decades-old structure that had made people rich off the incarceration and humiliation of men who looked like him. That night, he visited the house of the boy whose arrest had started everything. Darius, 16, sat on the porch with his mother, still bruised in body and in spirit. They looked up as Marcus approached, hesitant, unsure. But when Darius saw the man who had stood between him and the pavement, he got up and walked forward. His voice was soft but clear. "They said you're the one who stopped them. The one who turned it all upside down." Marcus crouched slightly so they were eye level. "I didn't do it for them. I did it for you. And kids like you who never get the chance to speak." Darius's mother came closer, her voice trembling. "They came to our house. The police told us we shouldn't talk. That we should just be grateful the charges were dropped." Marcus stood, jaw tight. "They threatened you?" She nodded, her eyes shining with fear and defiance. "But I'm not scared of them anymore. Not after what you did." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we have to make sure it lasts. Because if we stop now, they win again." The next morning, Nadine handed him a document folder. Inside was a full transcript from the tapped calls between Klein and two undisclosed parties. The voices were distorted, the content vague, but clear enough to show intent to mislead investigators, to obstruct justice, to destroy evidence. It was a start, but only that. It wouldn't be enough to carry charges, but it would be enough to rattle the cage. Marcus stared at it for a long moment before saying, "We leak it." Nadine's eyes widened. "You want to go public?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "They're trying to bury it with protocols. But the public pressure, that's something they can't control. We leak it to the press. Let them smell blood. Make the truth louder than their cover-ups." Nadine was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "But you know what happens next. If you do this, you burn your bridges. They won't let you work another field op. They might even push you out completely." Marcus looked at her with an intensity that didn't waver. "I'm not here for a career. I'm here for change." Within hours, the transcript had reached 2 major national outlets. Within 12 more, it was headline news. Audio clips played on air, transcripts analyzed by experts, former prosecutors interviewed about the implications. The public's outrage reignited. Phone lines to state offices flooded. Congressional aides released cautious statements. And the DOJ, cornered by the attention, was forced to acknowledge the existence of an ongoing federal inquiry. But behind that polished language, Marcus knew, there were closed-door meetings happening that would decide more than just his future. They would decide whether the people they served were still watching. He received the call from his supervisor the following night. The voice was colder than usual, distant. "Effective immediately, your assignment in Jackson is concluded. You're to report to D.C. for reassignment. You're to refrain from further media contact or public disclosure." Marcus didn't respond. The voice on the other end continued. "This is a formal directive. Do you understand, Agent Whitaker?" He let the silence linger, let the weight of what they were asking settle before finally answering. "I understand." The line went dead, and he sat back in the chair, surrounded by the chaos of notes, photos, timelines. Nadine walked in and didn't need to ask what had happened. She just sat down across from him. "You're going, aren't you?" He nodded. "I have to. But not before I finish what I started." That night, Marcus held a private meeting in the back room of a church, the same church where he'd attended community forums undercover weeks earlier. Seated around the table were local leaders, activists, lawyers, journalists, and families impacted by the broken system. He laid out everything, the names, the trails, the players still hidden in shadows. And he didn't ask for their help. He told them the truth. "They think it ends when I walk away. That when I leave this city, the light goes with me. But they're wrong. You are the light now." The crowd listened in silence, some nodding, some with tears, others clenching fists. He looked at them, these people who had suffered and fought and endured, and gave them everything he had. All his files. All his connections. All his work. "If they erase me, you'll still have the truth. If they silence me, you speak louder. If they come for you, stand together. Because they only win when we believe we're alone." As he left the church that night, the air felt different. Not lighter. But ready. And as he walked toward the black SUV waiting under the street lamp, Nadine called out from behind him. "You sure this is the only way?" He turned back, a small, tired smile on his face. "No. But it's the way that matters." What neither of them knew in that moment was that the very man who had called Marcus days earlier, the voice behind the warning, was watching. Not through cameras or phones. In person. Across the street, inside an unmarked car, a figure sat still, eyes locked on Marcus. A phone buzzed in his lap. He picked it up and answered with a single word, "Proceed." Whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't be fair. But Marcus was ready. Because now, he had nothing left to lose. 2 days before Marcus was scheduled to report back to Washington, a soft knock came at his hotel room door just after midnight. He hadn't been asleep. Sleep hadn't come easy since the phone call. Every hour had been filled with reports, updates, conversations he couldn't repeat, and decisions that left permanent marks. He opened the door to find Nadine standing there, her hair tied back, eyes intense, and holding an envelope in her hand. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she walked in slowly and placed the envelope on the desk before turning to face him. Her voice was steady but laced with a weight she hadn't shown before. "We found something else," she said. Marcus looked at her with a question already forming, but she lifted a hand. "You need to read it first." Inside the envelope were printed documents, transcripts of a conversation between a state senator and the same anonymous figure who had called Marcus days earlier. The file wasn't official. It hadn't come from the DOJ or any federal database. It had come through an encrypted source Nadine barely trusted herself, but she'd verified every line. The conversation made it clear, the corruption in Jackson wasn't just local. It was protected. And the voice on the call, calm, articulate, and terrifyingly casual, spoke about Marcus by name. Not as a man, but as a problem. A variable that needed to be controlled. He sat down as he read, and for the first time in the entire case, a flicker of doubt passed through him. Nadine walked to the window, crossing her arms as she stared out at the sleeping city. "They're planning something. I don't know when or how, but it's not over. Not even close." Marcus looked up, voice low and hollow. "Then we were never the target. The target is what we represent. Proof that they can be beaten." She nodded. "They'll make an example out of you." Quietly. No headlines. Just, gone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy, it was full. Full of what-ifs, of fear, of the kind of clarity that only comes when you realize how deep the hole goes. Then Marcus stood and walked to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small hard drive. He held it out to her. Take this. It's everything I haven't shared yet. If anything happens to me, you release it. All of it. Nadine hesitated. You're not going to DC, are you? Marcus didn't answer right away. Then he said, no. I'm going to Atlanta. She blinked, confused. Why Atlanta? He looked her in the eye. Because that's where the senator is. And if I'm going to be silenced, I'm at least going to knock on the devil's door first. The next evening, under a different name and in a different car, Marcus drove into Atlanta. The city lights felt colder than he remembered. He had been here once, years ago, during training. Back then, it had felt like a place of opportunity. Now it felt like a chessboard. Every block, every office tower, every conversation a calculated move. He wasn't chasing headlines anymore. He was chasing the route. And he knew that once he crossed this line, he might never come back. He met with an old contact, someone he trusted not because of their job, but because of how many times they'd turned down promotions to stay clean. Jamal Pearson worked quietly in cyber forensics and owed Marcus more than one favor. They met in the back of a bookstore off Auburn Avenue, surrounded by shelves of forgotten voices. Jamal listened without interrupting, scrolling through the files Marcus handed over. When he looked up, his voice was low. You're going to war with ghosts. These people don't have names, they have structures. They operate in shadows, and they don't leave footprints. Marcus replied, then I'll burn the shadows. Jamal gave him one thing, a name. Not a full name, but a codename used in internal databases. Monarch. It appeared on several secure memos tied to federal contracts and private prisons, always in advisory roles, always marked as confidential. The memo logs showed access from servers linked to lobbying firms, financial consultants, and political strategy offices. Marcus recognized one of the addresses. It traced back to the senator's office. Now he had a thread. All he had to do was pull. That night, he sent Nadine a single text, I have the first piece. Don't stop pushing. Her reply came seconds later. Neither should you. He spent the next 2 days moving like a ghost through the city, tracking meetings, watching buildings, using every tool the Bureau had taught him and every instinct his past had sharpened. On the third day, he found himself standing in the lobby of a high-rise downtown, dressed like an executive, holding a forged visitor badge. The receptionist smiled politely. Here to see Mr. Faulkner. Marcus nodded. Yes. Confirming the 3 p.m. Upstairs, the office was quiet and cold. The walls were gray, the art expensive but generic, the kind of place built to look important without saying anything. He was escorted into a conference room where a tall man in his late 50s stood waiting, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression that never changed. He extended a hand, and Marcus shook it, noting the firmness, the calculation. Mr. Whitaker, the man said, not bothering to pretend he didn't know. You've caused quite the storm. Marcus didn't sit. I'm not here for small talk. The man smiled. Of course not. You're here because you think this ends with a confession. Or a scandal. Or perhaps a noble sacrifice. Marcus's voice stayed calm. I'm here because people like you have ruled with silence. And I'm going to make that silence impossible. The man walked to the window, looking out over the city. You know what happens when you poke a bear? Marcus replied, it roars. The man turned, amused. No. It hunts. He stepped closer, his tone colder. You're a threat not because of what you know, but because of how loudly you speak. But loud doesn't last. Fear does. And fear keeps order. Marcus met his eyes. Then you're afraid. Because I'm not alone. And I'm not stopping. The man didn't flinch. You will. Eventually. One way or another. Because even if you survive, the system absorbs you. And if it can't, it deletes you. Marcus left that building with one truth confirmed: there was no going back. Not to the bureau. Not to Jackson. Not to the life he had before. He was a target now. But he was also something more. He was a symbol. And symbols, when they burn, light up the world. As he drove back toward the edge of the city, his phone buzzed again. A message from Nadine. It simply read, "They're moving. Get out now." He looked into the rearview mirror and saw it, a black sedan following too perfectly. No traffic. No mistakes. Just the slow, methodical glide of something inevitable. But Marcus didn't run. He smiled. He whispered, "Let's finish this." And turned off the main road, into the dark. The road he turned onto was narrow and unlit, surrounded by overgrown trees and fences that leaned like tired sentinels. The black sedan followed without hesitation, its headlights low and steady, keeping just enough distance to pretend discretion but close enough to confirm intent. Marcus kept his eyes forward, one hand gripping the wheel, the other resting lightly on the inside pocket of his jacket where his last piece of leverage, the encrypted drive, sat like a loaded weapon. He wasn't panicking. He was processing. Running every possibility through his mind like code, calculating outcomes, escape routes, backup plans. But what weighed on him more than the threat behind him was the truth ahead of him. Because what he was about to do, what he was already doing, wouldn't just put his life in danger. It would place a target on everyone who stood beside him. He knew once he crossed this next line, there would be no pause button, no safe house, no moment to breathe. This wasn't just exposure, it was war. He pulled the car into a decaying storage facility at the edge of the industrial zone. He had chosen this place for its emptiness, its broken cameras, its rusted gates. It was the kind of space forgotten by the city, discarded like so many of its people. As he stepped out of the car, he heard the sedan parked 50 feet behind him. The engine stayed running. The driver didn't emerge. Marcus didn't wait for an invitation. He walked toward them, slow but unwavering, as if daring them to make the first move. The driver's side door creaked open and a man stepped out, tall, clean-shaven, with a calmness that felt almost rehearsed. He didn't wear a uniform, didn't carry a visible weapon, but everything about his posture said violence was an option. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said with a faint smile, "this isn't how we hoped things would go." Marcus kept walking until he was just a few feet away. "Then you never understood me," he said evenly. The man tilted his head slightly. "You were supposed to play your part. Expose the surface, stir the pot, make it look like something changed. That was manageable. Even useful. But then you reached for the roots. And now you've made a mess." Marcus took a breath, slow, controlled. "No. You made the mess. I'm just turning on the lights." The man's smile faded. "We can still fix this. You walk away now, disappear quietly, and this all ends. No press. No trial. Just silence. You'd be surprised how much money silence can buy." Marcus shook his head, disgusted. "I'm not for sale. And I'm not afraid of you." The man's eyes narrowed. "Then you're not thinking clearly. Because if this continues, it won't be just you. It'll be Nadine. The families you helped. That boy, Darius. Everyone you pulled into this will pay the price." Marcus's fists clenched at the mention of the boy. "You're threatening a child now." The man didn't blink. "I'm promising consequences. You declared war on something bigger than politics. You declared war on design. And that kind of war always leaves casualties." For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the hum of distant traffic and the low crackle of a broken light above the gate. Then Marcus stepped forward, unzipped his jacket, and pulled out the drive. He held it in his palm like an offering, but his voice didn't soften. "You see this? This is a backup. There are more. And if I vanish, every one of them gets sent to every news outlet, every rights group, every public server. It's not just in my hands anymore. It's in the world's. You can stop me, but you can't stop this. The man studied the drive for a long second, then looked back at Marcus. You think the truth will save you? That's the problem with people like you. You think truth changes things. But it doesn't. Fear does. Marcus stared at him, and for the first time, he allowed the anger to bleed through. Then be afraid. Because I'm not stopping. And neither is the truth. The man didn't respond. He turned, walked back to the car, and drove off without another word. Marcus stood there, the air thick with everything that hadn't been said. He knew what this meant. They weren't trying to talk him down anymore. That was the last conversation before something permanent. And now the countdown had begun. The next morning, Nadine met Marcus at a safe location, a church basement repurposed into a community action center. The room was filled with activists, journalists, legal advisors, and young organizers who had stepped out of the shadows because of the fire Marcus had lit. They sat in folding chairs, drinking coffee, scrolling phones, whispering plans. But when Marcus entered, the room shifted. Everyone quieted. They could see it in his eyes, something had changed. He stood at the front, looking at them not as followers, not as allies, but as inheritors. They know we're here. They know what we found. And they're coming, not for truth, but for control. They'll call it national security. They'll call it protection. But it's suppression. They're trying to cut the voice from the body. But they can't kill it if it echoes. Nadine stepped forward and held up a flash drive. This is our insurance. If anything happens to Marcus, this gets broadcast live. Not a leak. A full release. Video, audio, names, faces. No filters. No edits. A young organizer named Simone raised her hand, her voice shaking. And if they come for us too? Marcus met her eyes. Then we remind them who we are. Not victims. Not shadows. We're louder than that. We're stronger than that. That night, Marcus sat alone in the back of the church, staring at the drive in his hand. So much of his life was inside it. His risks, his losses, his brother's story, the faces of boys who had never come home. He wasn't afraid to die, but he was afraid of dying quietly. Of being erased like so many before him. Of becoming just another name whispered in corners while the machine kept grinding. Nadine sat beside him, wordless at first. Then she said, "You changed something. You know that, right?" He looked at her, voice soft. "It's not enough. Not yet." She smiled gently. "Maybe not. But it's the beginning. And sometimes, beginnings are the hardest part." A phone buzzed. Marcus checked the screen. Unknown number again. This time, no voice. Just a message. "You made your choice. So did we." He read it once. Twice. Then deleted it. He knew what it meant. But he also knew something else. It was too late for them. The truth was already free. The morning the truth broke wide open, the sun seemed to rise differently over Jackson. It was early, just past 6 a.m., when a coordinated wave of uploads triggered from multiple encrypted sources. Marcus's drive, duplicated and programmed with redundancy, released everything. Not just pieces, not summaries, but the full weight of what had been hidden, videos of abuse and intimidation, audio recordings of backroom deals and racial slurs spoken by people in power, financial records connecting local arrests to national profit structures, emails between political offices, judges, and police chiefs exchanging favors like poker chips. It wasn't a leak. It was an explosion. And within hours, it became impossible for any network, any institution, or any official to ignore. The footage ran across every major news outlet. Anchor voices cracked as they read aloud transcripts too ugly to dress up with sanitized language. Law students, professors, lawyers, and activists dissected the material in real time. Hashtags took over the internet. Schools paused to talk about it. Community centers printed copies for people without internet access. People gathered around screens in barbershops, churches, gas stations. It wasn't just exposure, it was awakening. What had been buried for years under bureaucracy and fear was now laid bare for the world to see. And at the center of it all was the name Marcus Whitaker. In Washington, the DOJ scrambled to reframe the narrative. They issued official statements calling the operation unauthorized, trying to distance themselves from Marcus, even as internal agents whispered their admiration. A few tried to discredit him, questioning his methods, accusing him of going rogue. But the evidence spoke louder than any smear campaign, and for every attempt to silence his voice, 100 more lifted it higher. The public demanded trials, resignations, reform. Within 2 weeks, several arrests had been made. Senator Faulkner was forced to step down after direct links were found between his office and private incarceration investments. ADA Ballantyne struck a plea deal and agreed to testify against higher officials. Sergeant Klein was indicted on multiple federal charges and placed in solitary confinement for his own protection after receiving threats from within the prison system. Officer Doyle fled the state before being apprehended in Nevada. Travis Harlan, the man who once looked Marcus in the eye and saw only a suspect, now sat behind bars awaiting trial, his defense unraveling day by day. The same system they once weaponized now turned inward, and for once, they couldn't control it. Back in Jackson, the police department was placed under federal oversight. A complete overhaul began, starting with mandatory reviews, recertifications, and the removal of nearly half the department. Community leaders were invited into the process, voices that had once been ignored now forming the foundation of a new structure. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As for Nadine, she stepped fully into the spotlight, not for recognition, but to lead. She launched a legal coalition focused on defending victims of systemic abuse, not just in Jackson but statewide. Her name became synonymous with resilience, her story a testimony of what it means to fight from within. She gave speeches, taught classes, guided the next generation of truth-bearers. And through it all, she never stopped crediting Marcus, not as a martyr, but as a man who chose to stand when everything told him to sit down. And Marcus? He disappeared. Not in the way they had planned, not in silence, not in fear, but by choice. He refused interviews. Refused memoir deals. Turned down positions in major agencies and advisory roles in politics. Instead, he retreated from the noise, settling in a quiet town under a different name, living a life that didn't require attention. But even in absence, he was felt. Every reform that passed, every story that aired, every protest that chanted his name reminded the world that he wasn't a hero for what he exposed. He was a reminder that power without accountability is not power, it's a disease. And truth, when protected and shared, is the cure. Years later, a grainy video would surface online, unplanned, unpolished, recorded from a cheap phone in the back row of a local community forum in Birmingham, Alabama. A man, older now, stood at the front, speaking to a group of young organizers. He wore no suit, no badge, just a plain shirt and a voice that still carried like fire through dry grass. In the video, someone asked, "Are you Marcus Whitaker?" And the man smiled. "I used to be." Then he paused. "But now, I'm just a witness. To what happens when we stop waiting for justice, and start becoming it." And with that, he walked off stage. That was the last time anyone saw him. Now let me ask you something. What would you have done in Marcus's shoes? Would you have stayed quiet, safe, protected behind a job title and a pension? Would you have walked away when the system asked you to look the other way? Or would you have stood up, knowing that the moment you did, everything could be taken from you? This story isn't just about Marcus. It's about the people we become when no one is watching. It's about the weight of silence and the cost of truth. And maybe, just maybe, it's about what happens when one man decides that enough, really is enough. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think twice about the world we live in and the systems we've accepted for far too long, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Discuss it. Challenge it. And if you're still here with us, take a second to subscribe to the channel Tales of Twist. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We reveal them.